All right, I hope we're all set to go here on part 2 of the Gilded Age Politics, Chapter 20, Part 2. We left off last lesson with having seen Chester A. Arthur assume the presidency after the assassination of James Garfield. And so we'll pick up here with the presidential election of 1884, which sees Grover Cleveland winning the nomination for the Democrats, going against the Republican James Blaine. And what we see is with the continued division of the Republican Party over issues like the tariff, by 1884, Grover Cleveland is able to defeat Blaine to win the White House, which he becomes the first Democratic president since before the Civil War. And with the Democratic Party's ideas of limited government and states' rights, Cleveland looked to cut the federal government's activities and involvement in the economy and business and whatnot. And this includes the fact that he vetoed over 2/3 of the bills that Congress had sent him. But even with kind of that laissez-faire attitude, of kind of hands-off, Congress did pass and he did sign the Interstate Commerce Act, which set up the Interstate Commerce Commission, which really was kind of the first attempt at the federal government at regulating, particularly the railroads, kind of doing away with rebates and other business agreements. And it kind of sets the precedent for future attempts of the federal government to kind of regulate different parts of the economy. And here you can kind of see the political cartoon of Cleveland, using his veto to kind of control government and its activities, as well as he tried to lower the tariff, which is a kind of a mainstay for the Democratic Party. And eventually the Republicans will use that against him in the election of 1888, saying that he was trying to undermine the industry, which was still predominantly controlled by the north and northeastern parts of the United States. And that's precisely what Benjamin Harrison, the Republican candidate for president in '88, used against Cleveland, which helped secure his support not just in the north, but also some of those doubtful states we've talked about. And what we see is even though Cleveland wins more of the popular vote, he loses by a significant amount the electoral vote because of the higher population of the states in the north. It allows Harrison to be able to carry those states and therefore win the election. And as the political cartoon kind of suggests, how Harrison won perhaps some of those popular votes up in the north through coercion and persuasion, maybe attempting to get the working class or perhaps immigrants even to vote for him, which would ensure his election. Now you see, the Republicans didn't just win the presidency with Harrison in 1888, but they also won both houses of Congress. And so they're going to be able to pass legislation which will shape the future policy of the United States, including in 1890 passing the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was kind of the first attempt to try to break up big business and regulate kind of some of the more of the business activity. However, the problem with it was that it was vague and kind of left to the mercy of the courts, which actually further weakened it, especially in the Supreme Court case of United States versus the E.C. Knight Company of 1895, which really kind of crippled this piece of legislation as it made a distinction between commerce and manufacturing. But you'll read more about this in your book. And another piece of legislation passed was the McKinley Tariff, which to the dismay of the free trade supporters actually raised tariffs again, this time by 4%, to the highest rates that they'd ever been. And this was actually put forth by William McKinley, who will eventually be elected president himself. A third major bill passed was the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which dealt with coinage of silver as well as gold, which really kind of comes to be the dominant theme or issue in the last decade of the 1800s. You see, what had happened was with new discoveries of silver out west, silver flooded the market and drove prices down. Now, whereas many other countries in the world demonetized silver and based their economies just off a gold standard, the U.S. had earlier passed in 1878 the Bland-Allison Act, which kept the monetization of silver. Well, this new act, this Sherman Silver Purchase Act, continued the limited use of silver and kept the U.S. on a true bimetallic system. Now, this pleased the South and the West to the dismay of the Northeast, but it's an issue that we'll take a look at in future lessons as well. And by 1890, with the Republicans having controlled both houses and the presidency, the Democrats were calling the Republican Congress the billion-dollar Congress for all of the spending it did. Couple that with the growth of the government and federal power, and the Republicans suffered a huge setback in the 1890 elections and lost control of the House. And that, in turn, sets up a replay of the 1888 election. Again in 1892, then, we see Grover Cleveland, the Democrat nominee, once president, going against the Republican Benjamin Harrison, who was the current president. If you throw in the third party, the Populist Party or People's Party, who nominated James Weaver and created a platform where government would take ownership of railroads, the telephone and telegraph companies, as farmers really depended upon railroad companies for their rates of what they charged. They also stood for the monetization of silver, direct election of senators rather than state legislatures deciding who would be sent to the Senate. They also stood for the secret ballot and restrictions on immigration. But this Populist Party kind of stood for the farmers, the Westerners. It kind of grew out of the alliance system, which is another thing that you'll read more about in your textbook. But when it's all said and done, you can see that Grover Cleveland wins once again. Harrison will then be out of office, and we see that Weaver had some modest success out west. But with that, we'll take a closer look at Cleveland's second term and kind of the end of the 1800s in our next lesson.